You don't belong here." The words hit Tanya like a slap, but she didn't flinch. The hot summer sun beat down on the parking lot, and the sound of water splashing against the sides of the car was the only thing filling the air. Tanya, calmly scrubbing the hood of a black sedan, felt the sharp, condescending voice behind her before she even saw the man. Officer James Miller, a burly, arrogant cop, stood a few feet away, his arms crossed as he looked down at her with disdain. "What's a girl like you doing washing my car? You think this is a joke?" He laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. He made no attempt to hide his judgment, his gaze scanning her like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. Tanya paused for a moment, her hands still on the sponge, and then turned slowly to face him. Her expression was calm, unbothered. "I'm just doing my job," she said, her voice steady, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet strength that told a different story. Miller smirked, clearly unimpressed. "Yeah, I can see that. But I don't think you're cut out for this, sweetheart. Not with that attitude." Tanya didn't respond. She didn't need to. The man was nothing more than a passing nuisance, someone who thought he could talk down to her because of what he assumed was her place in the world. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that Tanya wasn't just a woman doing a menial job. She wasn't some sweetheart he could dismiss without consequence. Tanya was an undercover FBI agent, a seasoned investigator with the power to bring entire criminal networks down. But right now, she was playing a part, working in this quiet, sun-baked lot, observing. Miller's taunting words didn't bother her. She had seen worse. She had faced men like him, the kind who wore their biases like armor, thinking they could intimidate anyone. But she wasn't anyone. She was someone who would make sure his arrogance came crashing down. Miller, unaware of the storm he was about to unleash, continued to make offhand comments, calling her names, trying to belittle her. He didn't see the way she held herself, the way she carried her silence with such weight. Tanya finished washing the car and stood up, her back straight as she walked toward the entrance of the office. "I'll see you around, officer," she said over her shoulder, not looking back. The casual dismissal of her words lingered in the air as she entered the building, leaving Miller standing in the lot, unaware of the quiet storm he had just crossed paths with. The next day, Miller would wake up to a very different reality, one where his actions had consequences he never saw coming. The next morning, Officer James Miller walked into the police station, ready to face another day of work. He slung his bag over his shoulder and passed by the usual group of officers in the break room, exchanging casual hellos and grabbing their coffee. He was still thinking about Tanya from yesterday. What a strange encounter that had been. He brushed it off as nothing, just another day of doing his job. But then, as he entered his office, his phone buzzed on the desk. He picked it up and saw a message from his supervisor, Captain Harris. "Miller, meet me in my office now. Urgent." The sudden change in tone felt off, but he shrugged it off, figuring it was just about some paperwork or a routine task. As he entered the captain's office, Harris stood by the window, looking out, his back turned. "Have a seat, Miller," Harris said without turning around. "You've got some serious questions to answer." Miller's stomach dropped. "What's this about, sir?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Harris finally turned around, holding a thick file in his hand. He walked over to the desk and placed the file down with a loud thud. "You've been under investigation, Miller. A report came in last night. A woman named Tanya Carter. Ever heard of her?" The name caught Miller off guard. Tanya. He remembered her instantly. The woman washing his car. The one he had mocked. The one he had treated like she was beneath him. "I don't know her, sir," Miller replied, trying to stay calm. Harris raised an eyebrow. "She's an FBI agent, Miller. And she's been watching you for a while." Miller froze. His heart raced. How could she be an FBI agent? He had no idea, no clue. "You've been under investigation for misconduct, Miller. She's gathered evidence of your behavior yesterday. And it's not just her word against yours. We have surveillance footage, eyewitness statements, and reports that match up." Harris's voice grew stern. "You're being investigated for a pattern of racial discrimination. And your actions yesterday were the last straw." Miller's face went pale as the weight of what he had done sank in. He could hardly believe it. He never expected that the woman he had humiliated, the woman he had underestimated, would be someone with the power to take him down. But I didn't know," Miller stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Harris slammed his hand on the desk. "You didn't need to know, Miller. It doesn't matter. The fact is, you let your biases take control. And now, you have to answer for it. You've been reported to internal affairs, and the investigation is already in motion. Miller's mind raced. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His career, everything he had worked for, was now hanging by a thread. The weight of his actions was finally catching up with him. Harris handed him the file, pushing it toward him. Take a look at the evidence, Miller. You can either face the consequences or try to bury your head in the sand, but the truth's out there. And it's coming for you. Miller felt his hands tremble as he took the file. He flipped it open, and his eyes widened as he saw the images of Tanya, the woman he had disrespected, the woman who was now the reason his career was crumbling. He had no idea how deep he had just dug himself in. Tanya had shown him mercy yesterday, but now there was no escape. As he looked up at Harris, the reality hit him. His career was over. And all because of one mistake, one moment of pride and arrogance. The tables had turned, and he was on the wrong side of justice. The investigation into Officer James Miller's actions quickly escalated. By the end of the week, he found himself summoned to an internal affairs meeting. His mind was a blur, racing with thoughts of what could have been and what now awaited him. He had tried to convince himself that he would somehow get out of this, but deep down, he knew there was no way to escape the consequences of his actions. As he walked into the cold, sterile room, he was greeted by a team of investigators, their expressions neutral but firm. Captain Harris was there, standing in the back, arms crossed, watching as Miller took his seat. The head investigator, Officer Linda Burns, wasted no time. "Officer Miller," she began, her voice sharp and businesslike, "you've been under investigation for racial discrimination and misconduct. Based on the evidence provided, including eyewitness statements, surveillance footage, and reports from multiple sources, it's clear your actions yesterday crossed the line. You mistreated a civilian, a woman who turned out to be an undercover FBI agent. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Miller opened his mouth, but no words came out. His throat felt tight. He had no defense. The shame was overwhelming. "I didn't know she was FBI," he muttered, barely above a whisper. Burns nodded, her face expressionless. "That's irrelevant. The fact remains that you allowed your biases to cloud your judgment. You assumed she was beneath you, and you treated her with disrespect. That's the issue here." She paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. "This is not just about you and this woman. This is about a pattern of behavior that has been reported in the past, and now we are forced to take action." Miller felt his stomach drop as he heard the words. His career, his future, everything was slipping away. "We've also reviewed your record, Officer Miller," Burns continued. "While you've had a history of minor infractions, this incident is by far the most serious. Racial discrimination and mistreatment of civilians are not something we can overlook." Miller's hands were shaking now. He felt trapped, cornered by his own mistakes. He had never thought that one incident could unravel everything he had worked for. But here he was, facing the reality of what he had done. "I didn't mean to," Miller started, but he was cut off. "It doesn't matter what you meant, Miller," Burns said firmly. "What matters is the impact your actions have on the people around you, the community, and your colleagues. You have violated the trust that we put in you." Miller's heart sank even further as he realized the full extent of what he had done. He had hurt someone for no reason other than his own prejudice, and now it was too late to fix it. Burns turned to Captain Harris. "Captain, given the severity of the situation, we recommend immediate suspension pending further investigation." Harris nodded in agreement. "I'll be filing the necessary paperwork. Miller, you'll be on administrative leave effective immediately." Miller stood up, numb. His mind was spinning. He could barely process what had just happened. As he walked out of the room, he knew that his career was over. He had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. He had mistreated someone, and now he would pay the price for his actions. As he left the building, the weight of his failure pressed down on him. He had taken so much for granted, and now it was all slipping away. The only thing left for him now was to face the consequences, and he knew they were only just beginning. As the days passed, Officer James Miller's life seemed to spiral out of control. His suspension became official, and he was left to deal with the reality of what he had done. The police station, once familiar and full of camaraderie, now felt distant and cold. He was no longer part of the team, no longer someone who could walk into the break room and exchange jokes with his colleagues. Every time he passed by a mirror, he saw the man who had made one fateful mistake, and his reflection seemed to mock him. What had happened to the confident officer who once walked with his chest puffed out, believing he was untouchable? Miller spent the following days in a haze of regret, replaying the events over and over in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about Tanya, the woman he had so easily underestimated, the woman he had humiliated without a second thought, had turned out to be an FBI agent. She wasn't just anyone. She was someone with the power to bring him down, and she had done it. She had exposed his deep-seated prejudices and forced him to face the ugliness within himself. The weight of his actions was suffocating. Every time he thought about the way he treated Tanya, he felt the sting of shame all over again. He had seen the way she stood her ground, calm and unflinching, even when he tried to belittle her. He remembered how she had not responded to his taunts, how she had simply turned her back and walked away, leaving him to stew in his own ignorance. It was a moment of pure power. Her silence was louder than anything he could have said. Tanya had known exactly who she was, and she had known exactly who he was. But the truth was, he hadn't known who she was at all, and that ignorance had cost him everything. Miller had tried to defend himself when the investigation started. He had claimed it was a misunderstanding, that he didn't know Tanya was an FBI agent, but deep down, he knew that excuse was hollow. It didn't matter who she was. What mattered was the way he had treated her. He had let his own biases cloud his judgment, and in doing so, he had violated the very principles he had sworn to uphold. The internal affairs meeting had been a turning point. It had been the moment when the truth hit him like a brick wall. He wasn't the man he thought he was. He wasn't the person he wanted to be. And now, there was no going back. The evidence was clear, and his career was hanging by a thread. Miller sat alone in his apartment, staring at the blank walls. The silence around him felt deafening. He had tried to drown out the guilt with distractions, working out, drinking beer with old friends, even cleaning his apartment, but none of it worked. The shame was always there, lurking in the background. It was only when he looked at his phone, at the messages from his colleagues, that he realized how deep his isolation had gone. They were all gone now, his friends, his peers. The ones who once called him a good cop were now silent, no longer reaching out, no longer offering support. The only voice he heard now was his own, telling him that he had failed, that he had let everyone down, including himself. And then, one evening, as Miller was about to pour himself another drink, his phone buzzed again. He glanced down at the screen and saw the name that made his stomach drop. Tanya Carter. She had sent him a message. "We need to talk." His heart raced. What did she want now? Was this the moment when she would finish him off completely? Or was there something else, something he didn't yet understand? He stared at the screen, unsure of what to do. Should he respond? Should he ignore it and let everything fade away into the silence? One thing was certain. He couldn't keep running from the consequences of his actions forever. He took a deep breath, put down the glass, and typed a reply. "Okay, let's talk." The next day, Officer James Miller found himself waiting in a small cafe, staring at the clock on the wall. The minutes dragged on as he thought about the message he had received from Tanya Carter. He had no idea what she wanted, but he knew it was time to face the music. The guilt from his past actions was still fresh, like a weight pressing down on his chest. He had tried to avoid this moment, to bury his feelings and the consequences of his mistakes, but now, there was no turning back. Tanya had agreed to meet him, and as he looked around the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something that would change everything. A soft chime rang from the door as it opened, and in walked Tanya. She looked exactly the same as the day they had met. Calm, poised, and confident. She scanned the room briefly before locking eyes with him. She made her way over to his table and sat down without saying a word. For a moment, there was only silence between them. Tanya took a deep breath and broke the quiet. "I know what you're thinking, Miller," she said, her voice steady. "You're wondering if I'm here to finish you off, right?" Miller swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He nodded slowly, not trusting his voice. "Yeah," he replied, barely audible. I'm not here to destroy you," Tanya said, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm here because I want you to understand something. What happened between us wasn't just about me. It was about you. It was about how you let your own biases shape your actions, and how those actions have consequences, not just for me, but for the people you work with, for your community, and for yourself." Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But Tanya's gaze was unwavering. I didn't want to hurt you, he said, his voice cracking. I didn't know who you were. I was just… Tanya raised a hand, silencing him. It doesn't matter who I am, Miller. What matters is how you treated me, how you assumed I was less than you, and how that assumption led to a chain of events that could have ruined your life. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in. But I'm giving you a chance to change. I'm giving you a chance to own up to what you did and to make things right. That's more than most people get. Miller's mind was spinning. He had never expected this. He had thought she would be angry, bitter, maybe even cruel. But instead, she was offering him a lifeline, a chance to redeem himself. He could hardly believe it. Why? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why are you giving me a chance? Tanya's eyes softened. Because I believe people can change, she said simply. But it's up to you whether or not you take that chance. I'm not here to play savior. I'm here because you need to face the reality of what you've done, and you need to be the one to take the first step toward making things right. Miller sat back in his chair, feeling a flood of emotions he had never allowed himself to feel before. He realized, in that moment, how much he had taken for granted. His career, his pride, his actions, they had all been wrapped up in his own sense of superiority. And now, he saw just how fragile it all was. He had the power to change, to rebuild what he had broken. But it would take effort, humility, and time. He looked at Tanya, truly seeing her for the first time. I don't know where to start, he said quietly. Tanya smiled, a faint, knowing smile. The first step is admitting that you were wrong. And you've already done that. Miller nodded, his heart heavy but lighter than it had been in days. Thank you, he said, his voice sincere. Thank you for giving me this chance. Tanya stood up, ready to leave. I'm not doing this for you, Miller. I'm doing it for what's right. Just remember, you have a choice now. Don't waste it. With that, she walked out of the cafe, leaving Miller to process everything that had just transpired. He sat there, alone, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely lost. He had a long road ahead of him, but he was ready to take that first step toward redemption. Over the next few weeks, Officer James Miller took the long, hard journey of self-reflection. He attended therapy, attended workshops on bias and racism, and even started reading books that challenged his preconceived notions. Every day was a struggle, but with each small step, he felt a little less like the man he had been and a little more like the man he wanted to become. He made the difficult decision to publicly apologize for his actions, something he never thought he would be capable of doing. It wasn't easy. Standing in front of his colleagues, knowing they had witnessed his behavior, was one of the hardest things he had ever done. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. I made a mistake, he said, his eyes meeting the gaze of each officer in the room. I allowed my biases to control my actions, and I hurt someone in the process. That's not who I am, and it's not who I want to be. There was silence after he finished, and for a moment, he wondered if they would ever look at him the same way again. But then, Captain Harris spoke up. Officer Miller, he said, his voice calm but firm. You've taken the first step in making things right. The road ahead won't be easy, but you've shown that you're willing to put in the work. Miller nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He knew the journey wouldn't be over after one apology, but it was a start. Later that week, he received a letter in the mail. It was from Tanya Carter. She had written him a note of encouragement, telling him that she had seen the changes in him and that she believed he was on the right path. I know it's not easy, the letter read, but change doesn't happen overnight. Keep pushing forward, keep learning, and remember, you're not alone. Miller held the letter in his hands, his chest tightening with emotion. He had been given a second chance, not just by Tanya, but by himself. It was a humbling realization. Slowly, Miller began to rebuild the trust of his colleagues. Some were skeptical at first, but over time, they saw the sincerity in his efforts. He didn't expect forgiveness from everyone, but he was determined to earn it. A few months later, Miller received a call from Tanya. How are you doing? She asked, her voice warm. Better, Miller replied, a smile tugging at his lips. A lot better. They spoke for a while, catching up on life, and Miller felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It was the first time he truly felt at peace with himself. Tanya didn't offer him a free pass or pretend that everything was fine. She had held him accountable, and now, he was doing the same for himself. The call ended with Tanya reminding him of one simple truth. You're not defined by your past mistakes, Miller. What matters is how you move forward from here. Those words stuck with him. It was the first time he had ever truly believed in the possibility of change. Miller knew his journey wasn't over, and it might never be. But he was no longer afraid of the work it would take to become a better person. He was ready to keep moving forward, one step at a time. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was finally heading in the right direction. Months passed, and Officer James Miller found himself in a much different place than he had been when he first received Tanya's message. The road to redemption wasn't easy, and every day was a reminder of the weight of his past mistakes. But he had committed to changing, and with each passing day, he saw the results of his efforts. He was no longer the officer who had walked through the doors of the police station, full of arrogance and pride. Instead, he was someone willing to learn, to listen, and to take responsibility. His colleagues had started to notice the change. Some of them, particularly the younger officers, sought his guidance. They saw him as a mentor, someone who had gone through the fire and come out on the other side better for it. Miller found himself sharing his experiences, teaching others what he had learned about accountability, humility, and the importance of examining one's own biases. It was a role he had never imagined himself in, but one he embraced with sincerity. His work wasn't just about enforcing the law anymore. It was about understanding the people he served and ensuring they were treated with dignity and respect. He was determined to prove that he had earned the right to be a part of that community again. One day, Miller was assigned to a community outreach event, a program aimed at building trust between the police department and the local neighborhood. The event was at a community center, and it was his first real chance to interact with the people he had once been so quick to judge. He arrived early, feeling a mixture of excitement and nerves. As he stood by the registration table, he saw people arriving. Families, young adults, and children, all walking into the space with hopes of bridging the gap between their community and law enforcement. When it was time for him to speak, he took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. "I know that I'm not here to tell you anything you don't already know," he began, his voice calm but filled with sincerity. "But I want to be clear about one thing. I'm here because I know I've let you down. I've made mistakes, and I've hurt people because of my own ignorance. But I'm trying to be better. I'm trying to understand, and I'm here today to listen. I want to hear your stories, and I want to do what I can to make things right." There was a moment of silence in the room. Miller could feel the weight of the eyes on him. Some people were skeptical, others were open, but all were listening. Then, a woman in the crowd spoke up. "What makes you think we should trust you?" Her voice wasn't angry, but it was firm. "What makes you different from the officers who've hurt us before?" Miller nodded, understanding the question. "I can't undo the past," he said quietly. "But I can promise you this. I'm here to listen. And I'm here to make sure we do things differently moving forward. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight. But I want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem." The woman looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "All right," she said. "We'll see." The rest of the event was filled with conversations, some difficult, some hopeful, but all of them meaningful. Miller stayed for hours, listening to the community members and sharing his own story. It was the start of something new, a long and uncertain journey, but it was a start. Later that evening, as Miller walked back to his car, he felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't a peace that came from knowing everything was fixed, but it was a peace that came from knowing he was on the right path. He wasn't perfect, and he knew there would be more obstacles ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. He wasn't just a cop anymore. He was a man who had faced his own mistakes and was doing the hard work to make things right. And that, he realized, was enough. Months later, Officer James Miller stood at the podium once again, this time in front of a crowd much larger than the one he had faced at the community center. He had been invited to speak at a law enforcement conference, a chance to share his journey and the lessons he had learned with officers from all over the country. His hands were slightly trembling as he adjusted the microphone, but there was no trace of the nervousness that had once overwhelmed him. He cleared his throat, took a deep breath, and began. "I never thought I would be standing here, speaking to all of you about my mistakes. When I first started in law enforcement, I thought I had it all figured out. I believed in justice, in fairness, and I thought I was doing good in the world. But I was wrong. I didn't realize the bias I was carrying, the assumptions I was making about people based on their skin color, their background, their life experiences. He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. I mistreated a woman. A woman who was just doing her job, washing my car. I mocked her, belittled her, all because I assumed I knew who she was. But I didn't know anything. She wasn't just some random woman. She was an undercover FBI agent, and she exposed the ugliness inside me. It was a wake-up call, one that forced me to confront my own biases and my actions. And let me tell you, it wasn't easy. It was humbling. It was painful, but it was necessary. Miller looked out at the audience, making eye contact with several officers who were listening intently. He could see the skepticism in their eyes, and he understood it. He had been that skeptical officer once too. I know there are some of you here who might think, that won't happen to me. I'm not like that. But let me tell you, none of us is immune. We all have biases, whether we like it or not. And the hardest thing is not recognizing them. It's doing something about them. He took another deep breath, letting his words sink in. I'm not here to tell you that I'm perfect, that I've changed overnight. It's been a long road, and I'm still learning. But I'm here because I want you to know that it's possible to change. It's possible to recognize the harm we cause and take responsibility for it. It's possible to take a hard look at ourselves and admit that we're not always the people we think we are. And it's possible to be better. There was a pause in the room, a stillness that Miller could feel deep in his chest. He could sense that some officers were uncomfortable with what he was saying, but there were others who were nodding, who were listening. And that gave him hope. I'm not asking you to be perfect, he continued. I'm asking you to be honest with yourselves. I'm asking you to question your assumptions, to challenge the way you see the world, and to do better. Because that's what we owe the people we serve. We owe them fairness, respect, and dignity. As he finished, Miller felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. But it was the kind of exhaustion that came from doing something difficult, something meaningful. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. Later that evening, as he sat in the hotel room, Miller received a message. It was from Tanya. I saw your speech today. Proud of you, Miller. You're on the right track. Keep going. He stared at the message for a moment, the words ringing in his ears. Tanya had been his first teacher, the one who had shown him the mirror he didn't want to look into. And now, she was acknowledging the progress he had made. It was a small thing, but it meant the world to him. Miller smiled to himself, feeling a quiet sense of peace settle over him. The journey wasn't over, but he was no longer running from his mistakes. He was facing them head-on, one day at a time. And that was all he could do. Months had passed since Officer James Miller delivered his speech, and he found himself in a new place, both professionally and personally. The police department had decided to give him a second chance, but not without conditions. He was placed in community outreach programs, tasked with working directly with the public to rebuild the trust that had been shattered by his actions. It wasn't easy, and there were days when Miller doubted his own ability to change. The weight of his past still hung over him, a constant reminder of the mistakes he had made. But as time went on, he began to see small victories, moments where he could feel the shift in how people viewed him. One afternoon, he was standing in a neighborhood meeting, listening as a local resident shared her experiences with the police. Her voice was full of frustration, but there was a sense of hope in her words too. She spoke about the need for more understanding, for more empathy, from the officers in their community. As she finished speaking, she looked directly at Miller. You're here because you want to make a difference, she said, her voice softer now. We just need to know that you understand us, that you see us as people, not criminals. The words hit Miller harder than he expected. It wasn't just about following the law. It was about seeing the humanity in others, no matter their background or circumstances. That night, Miller sat in his car after the meeting, his mind racing. He thought back to his earlier days as an officer, how he had walked through the streets with a sense of superiority, believing that he knew better than the people he served. But now he saw the truth. He didn't know them. He hadn't taken the time to understand their struggles, their lives, their pain. And that realization hit him hard. It was a sobering moment, but it was also liberating. For the first time, he understood that the real work of being a police officer wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about listening, learning, and acknowledging the experiences of those you served. Over the following weeks, Miller threw himself into his work. He attended more meetings, spoke to more community members, and listened to their stories. He didn't have all the answers, but he wasn't afraid to ask questions. He began to build connections, not just with the people in the neighborhood, but with his fellow officers as well. They began to see the change in him, the sincerity in his efforts. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. And that was enough. One evening, as Miller was finishing up his shift, he received a call from Tanya. "You're doing good work, Miller," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "I've been hearing about the progress you're making. Keep it up." Miller smiled at the words, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Thanks, Tanya. It means a lot to hear that from you." They spoke for a few more minutes, catching up on life, and as they ended the call, Miller felt a sense of gratitude. Tanya had been the one to help him open his eyes, to see the world differently. She had been the first person to challenge him, to hold him accountable, and now, she was one of the few who still believed in his ability to change. The following weekend, Miller found himself standing in front of a group of new recruits at the police academy. It was the first time he had been asked to speak to a group of young officers, and he was nervous. He stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of eager faces. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life," he began, his voice steady. "And I've learned that the biggest mistake I made was not seeing people for who they really are. I didn't understand the power of empathy, of truly listening to others. But I'm here today because I want to help you avoid making the same mistakes I did. You have to approach this job with an open heart and a willingness to learn. Because the people you serve are not just cases, they're not just numbers, they are human beings. And if you don't see them as such, you'll never truly serve them." The room was silent as Miller finished his speech. He didn't know if his words had reached anyone, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was finally speaking from a place of truth, a place of understanding. He wasn't the same officer he had been when he first put on the uniform, and as he looked out at the new recruits, he knew that he was ready to continue his journey, not just as a police officer, but as someone who had truly learned what it meant to serve with integrity, humility, and compassion.